There are not many who haven't heard of London's Jack the Ripper, but few are aware of the existence of his southern counterpart, who was equally as ruthless and evil, and who had an entire city panic-stricken and terrorized during the early 1900s. To this day, no one knows for sure who the Atlanta Ripper was, but the appalling murder and mutilation of nearly 20 African American women occurred at a time of high tensions in the USA. Since much of the South was still gripped by racism and segregation, the killings weren't given the attention they deserved until the Ripper had already amassed a large number of victims, and finally caused outrage amongst Atlanta's citizens so that they could no longer be ignored by the authorities. The sad fact is that the culprit behind the unsolved Atlanta Ripper murders was emboldened by the lack of investigation into the killings, which gave him growing confidence to take more lives. The increased brutality of each slaying, the threatening notes attached to the fireboxes across the city, the killer's apparent fascination with his victim's shoes, all create a grisly and disturbing glimpse into the mind of an insane murderer. Whether the Atlanta Ripper identity belonged to a conglomeration of different individuals or a single predator is still hotly contested. And over a century later, the question still remains: who was the Atlanta Ripper? The Atlanta Ripper claimed his first victim in January 1911 with the murder of Rosa Trice. Rosa's body was found near Gardner Street, and it was in a horrifying state. Her head had been crushed and her throat was cut, reports saying that it was slashed from ear to ear. More victims were found in the Grant Park area, and by the spring of 1911 the killing spree had grown. Other victims included Belle Walker, Addie Watts, Lena Sharp, Sadie Holly, and there were more adding to the list. Perhaps the most frightening encounter was experienced by Emma Lou Sharp, a young woman who is widely believed to have come face to face with the Atlanta Ripper after he had killed her own mother. When Lena Sharp failed to return home from a shopping trip one evening, her 20-year-old daughter Emma Lou panicked and began to search for her. She was well aware of the crazed murderer who had been terrorizing the community. She quickly retraced her mother's steps to the local market, only to learn that her mother had never reached her destination. While desperately searching the neighborhood, she encountered a man who she described to authorities as tall, black, broad-shouldered and wearing a broad-brimmed black hat. After he asked her how she was, a wary Emma Lou responded that she was very well, thank you, and attempted to politely step around the man who was blocking her path. "Don't be afraid," the stranger replied. "I never heard girls like you." He then proceeded to stab her in the back. Emma Lou pulled away and ran screaming for help, while the large man let out a laugh and fled down an adjoining alley. Emma Lou was unaware at the time that she was only meters away from the corpse of her brutally slain mother, and that she was one of the few who had managed to survive an encounter with the devil of Atlanta. After Emma Lou's hysterical screams drew a considerable crowd, a search party was formed of several able men who were sent off to scour the streets and who soon found the body of her beloved mother. She was found near the Seaboard Railroad tracks. Lena Sharp had suffered a large gash across her throat and her head was resting in a puddle of blood. The slash to her throat was so brutal that she was nearly decapitated. A prominent Atlanta undertaker then posted a $25 reward for the capture of the maniac who slaughtered Lena Sharp. On Saturday, July the 8th, Mary Yeddle, a cook for the W.M. Seltzer household, was leaving her employer's residence when she heard piercing whistling coming from a nearby alleyway. The 22-year-old then saw a tall black stranger approaching her at rapid pace, which sent her shrieking back to inform the head of the household. Mr. Seltzer quickly ran towards the alley, revolver in hand, and found the man lurking in the shadows. When Seltzer trained the gun on him, the suspicious acting individual used the darkness of the passageway to his advantage to disappear into the night. Upon an apparent thorough investigation of the surrounding area, police were unable to locate the suspect, and Mary Yeddle narrowly avoided becoming yet another name on the Atlanta Ripper's growing list.
Halt! Who goes there? Show yourself, man.
A certain Will Broglen was on his way to work one morning when something caught his attention in a patch of wasteland along the way. Investigating further, he stumbled upon the savagely mutilated corpse of Sadie Holly. Her throat had been slashed ear to ear and her head caved in with a fist-sized rock that was later found discarded in a nearby field, covered in blood. The dead girl's shoes had been removed and were missing from the scene. Despite falling in the middle of the Ripper's victim list, Sadie was the first to be featured on the front page of the Atlanta Constitution. On June the 15th, 1911, another apparent victim of the Ripper, a young woman named Adie Watts, was found close to the Southern Railway, her head completely smashed in by a coupling pin from a train, which police later found nearby. Her throat had been violently cut before her body was dragged and dumped near the tracks. Coincidentally or not, Adie Watts had been a neighbor of Emma Lou and Lena Sharp. Fiercely debated as being the Atlanta Ripper's first victim, 35-year-old Rosa Trice was murdered sometime in January of 1911. Her body discovered on Gardner Street and was so terribly mutilated that it would set the standard for the level of brutality to be inflicted on the Ripper's future victims. The left side of Rosa's head was completely crushed and her throat cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her neck. Her jaw had also been stabbed and she was attacked only a very short distance from the safety of her home. On the evening of Saturday, May the 27th, 1911, Marybel Walker left her job as a cook at a residence on Cooper Street and headed off into the dark streets to her home. The following morning her sister discovered that her bed was empty and began a frantic search of the property. Belle was soon found in a paddock at the rear of the house with a jagged cut across her throat. It wasn't until Belle Walker's death that the white-owned and staffed newspapers began to even report the grisly deaths terrifying the African-American community of Atlanta. On November the 21st, 1911, another body was found partially buried under loose earth in a ditch near the juncture of Stewart Street and the Belt Line. When Mary Putman's body was discovered at 7 a.m., she was still warm to the touch. Mary's throat and breast had been viciously slashed, and the killer's handprints were plainly visible in the dirt around the body. The most disturbing sign of the Ripper reaching a frenzied crescendo was that Mary's heart had been ripped out and was found lying next to her. Not content with that atrocity, the fiend also disemboweled her. When a bloodhound reached the scene, it followed a trail for 200 yards that abruptly ended at the car line. The cause of death was determined to be a broken skull and lacerated throat wounds, the other outrages being apparently carried out post-mortem. As touched upon earlier, one of the most peculiar aspects of the killer's modus operandi was that several of his victims had their shoes cut from their bodies. In most instances they were found nearby, but in the case of Sadie Holly, they were completely missing from the scene. A November the 24th, 1911 news article even went so far as to point out the whereabouts of footwear for two of the victims, noting that in one case the woman's shoes were not molested. Why the Ripper was so fixated on the victim's shoes remains a mystery still. In March 1914, firefighters began to find notes pinned to the fireboxes all over the city. The notes had a chilling message to impart. The killer, if it was indeed the same person, threatened to cut the throats of all Negro women who happened to be outside after a certain time of night, and were all signed Jack the Ripper. Fire Station House 2 received 3 false alarm calls which were believed to have been raised by the killer in order to draw attention to the letters. Whether it was truly the Atlanta Ripper or merely a hoax by a sick-minded individual is still unknown. A cook working for a household at Inman Park, a Miss Ellen Maddox, was on her way home from work when she was attacked from behind and bashed over the back of the head with a blunt object. She was beaten so savagely that her head totally caved in, and her facial features left completely unrecognizable. Despite the horrors she had endured, Elle was still clinging on to life and managed to communicate with detectives, who had quickly went to question her at the hospital. With her fading energy, she managed to speak a few last words about the attack. "He ran up behind me and hit me, and then..." Unfortunately, those were the only words Ellen could utter before she finally succumbed to her horrific wounds. The Atlanta Ripper is believed to be responsible for the deaths of nearly 20 African American women. The official number during the 4-year spree is not confirmed and is still a cause of debate. The standard modus operandi for these slayings was that the victims were approached from behind, clubbed over the back of the head, and then dragged off to another area where they had their throats slit and bodies mutilated in some way. The victims were all from lower class neighborhoods and attractive young women. Due to the violence and savagery of the murders, the Atlanta culprit was officially compared to London's Jack the Ripper in a June 16, 1911 article.
Don't be afraid. I never heard girls like you.
The police were stumped for clues to the killer's identity, and as each murder took place, they were no nearer to catching the culprit, which eventually spurred community leaders and churches to offer rewards for the capture of the fiend. With the similarities between many of the murders becoming gradually obvious, Atlanta law enforcement authorities believed they were looking for a lone serial killer. However, in March 1912, a grand jury concluded that each murder was committed by a different African American man, although they never explained how they reached this conclusion. They stated that each case was the result of jealousy following immoral conduct. Adhering to the bizarre theory that the Atlanta Ripper was a myth, authorities kept arresting and sometimes convicting different black men for the crimes, but rarely won convictions due to having only circumstantial evidence. Henry Huff, a 27-year-old labourer, was arrested for the murder of Sadie Holly. What initially led police to Huff was that witnesses reported seeing him with Holly the night she died. When he was arrested, Huff's trousers were caked in dirt and blood, and he had several long scratches on his arms. Although during the time he was remanded to custody awaiting trial, the Ripper murders continued. This knowledge may have led to Henry Huff being eventually found not guilty in the death of Sadie. Emma Lou Sharp tentatively identified the man who had stabbed her in the back as 35-year-old Todd Henderson. He was also spotted in a drugstore with Sadie Holly the night of her murder, and his shoes matched a print left at the crime scene. As a straight razor was believed to have caused the terrible wounds, police questioned him about owning one, but Henderson angrily denied even owning one until police discovered that he had in fact dropped a razor off at a local barber shop to be sharpened the morning after Sadie Holly was butchered. Despite the hopes held by law enforcement that Henderson was their man, the evidence remained circumstantial and was eventually dropped by a grand jury. There were several other arrests made during the Ripper's killing spree: John Daniel, Henry Brown and Charlie Owens. However, Todd Henderson and Henry Huff were brought to trial and found not guilty. After the arrest and incarceration of John Daniel, the murders continued, which cast a doubt as to whether Daniel was the murderer, or at least making it appear that he did not work alone. Henry Brown was acquitted after it was revealed that the Atlanta police had beaten a confession out of him. But Charlie Owens was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison for one of the murders. Many doubt that Owens was guilty because they point to the fact that after Owens was put in jail, the vicious murders continued. So, was Owens the Atlanta Ripper who had teamed up with a murdering accomplice? Or were there several copycat Rippers? Or was there only one and the authorities convicted the wrong person? Most criminologists say that serial killers tend to carry out their crimes alone, And if we remember statements from his victims, they never mentioned there being more than one person who attacked them. The killings finally stopped in 1914 with the death of Laura Smith, and Atlanta residents could slowly put this terrifying killing spree behind them, although I suspect it must have taken many of its residents years before they felt safe again walking out after dark. And how terror-stricken the young ladies must have felt during the killer's evil timeline, having no other option but to walk home alone in the dark from their place of employment. Well, my dear friends, I hope you enjoyed that feature, and a warm welcome to any newcomers. Welcome aboard Oddie's ship of oddities. Yeah, this feature was quite a difficult one regarding the images. There was only very few images, factual images for this case, and apart from the newspaper clippings. But yeah, so bear with me. I have just come up with images that I thought would flesh the story out, so to speak, and yeah, so I hope I've done a good job. You tell me. Yeah, as I say, it's very difficult, some of these cases where there is no images, particularly the vintage cases. With the modern cases, you'll get an abundance of media to accompany it, but with the old ones, I just have to sort of. It literally took me hours to come up with the images for this, so be aware of that. Yeah, it does take a lot of time. Sometimes I get very frustrated looking for something suitable, but I get there in the end. That's the main thing. I get there in the end. I'm not whinging, by the way. You know, I'm used to doing this, and some features are harder to find the images for than others, and this was one of them. So anyway, we got there in the end. That is all that matters. And yeah, those on YouTube who are not a part of Patreon don't know what they're missing out on, because I've got some very good cases coming up in the future. Yeah, it's a shame I can't put these on YouTube, and but it's not a shame for us because we get to watch them. So, and as always, I thank you for your support, and it's support with rewards. We all get something out of it, and that's great. You're helping me to get towards my goal of being able to create these videos all the time, instead of having to juggle and stress my time working in my normal day-to-day job. And but because of this money that I've got so far every month, I'm able to take an extra day off now, so that is fantastic. That's all down to you guys that I'm able to do that. I've got an extra 3-day, which I didn't have at the start before I started Patreon, so that's an extra day I get to work on the videos. And so each and every one of you are responsible for that, and I'm really indebted. Thank you so much, my friends, for believing in me. Yeah, I don't want to get too sentimental, but thank you. I'm holding back a tear here. No, really, sincerely, thank you, my friends. And I'm glad you're enjoying it. And I'm starting to ramble, and I'm not going to ramble too much. I'll tell you why. Because I want to get another feature out for everyone. It's for Halloween. I know what it is. Yes, this is not a reader story, by the way. This was a true case of a haunting in England, and I'm looking forward to getting on with that, cracking on with that. I want that out before the end of this month, so I'm going to love you and leave you, and looking forward to your comments as always. God bless, take care, and I will see you all soon. Thank you, my friends. Bye bye.